From the summer of 1944, the Second World War takes a decisive, positive turn for the Allies. The triumphant D-Day landings in June were not an end, but the beginning of the end. The next 90 days, July, August, and September, would prove to be the final breaking point for the Third Reich. This was not simply a war on a single front. It was a total, cascading failure on three. The first was the War of Maps and Armies, as Allied forces clawed their way out of Normandy and the Red Army prepared a catastrophe for the Wehrmacht in the east. The second was a new war against the home front, as Hitler unleashed weapons of pure vengeance. And the third, most secret war, was fought inside Germany itself, a battle for the nation's soul, culminating in a plot by Hitler's own officers to eliminate the Führer. This is the story of that summer, when a wavering Reich finally began to tear itself apart. But the triumph of D-Day, the greatest amphibious assault in history, did not lead to a swift liberation. It led to a quagmire. The beaches of Normandy almost immediately gave way to the bocage, a landscape from hell. This was not the open warfare Allied planners had anticipated. It was a savage, close-quarters fight in a claustrophobic maze of ancient sunken lanes and thousand-year-old hedgerows. These dense earthen mounds, some 10 feet high and choked with impenetrable roots, formed a near-perfect defensive network. Each field was a fortress, each lane an ambush. Seasoned German panzer divisions, masters of defense, turned this labyrinth into a killing field. Allied tanks designed for breakthrough were funneled into single-file lines, easy prey for hidden anti-tank guns and Panzerfausts. Infantry, advancing blind, paid for every single yard in blood. By early July, the advance had stalled, reduced to measuring progress in a few thousand agonizing yards per day. The optimism of June was drowning in the mud of July. This was not a breakthrough. It was a brutal, meat-grinding stalemate. A new, more violent solution was desperately needed. While the Allies bled for every hedgerow in France, a different war was raging in the east. This was not a slow grind, it was an avalanche. On June 22, 1944, just weeks after D-Day, the Red Army unleashed Operation Bagration. This was not a battle, it was a reckoning. 4 entire Soviet fronts, over 2 million men, slammed into the German Army Group's center in Belarus. The result was the single most terrible defeat inflicted on the German armed forces during the entire war.
Where the Allies fought for yards, the Soviets advanced by hundreds of miles. In 5 weeks, they utterly annihilated Army Group Center, destroying the 4th and 9th Armies and the 3rd Panzer Army. The Wehrmacht didn't just retreat, it disintegrated. The Axis lost 20 divisions. German losses were so catastrophic, over 670,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, that forced conscription at home could no longer replace the dead. The impenetrable Eastern Front had been torn open. As Allied troops were still fighting to break out of Normandy, the unstoppable Red Army was already sweeping over Poland, and its sights were set firmly on the borders of Germany itself. With his armies being bled white in France and utterly shattered in the east, Adolf Hitler had to react. But he didn't unveil a new army, he unveiled a new kind of war. He had long promised his people a Wunderwaffe, a secret weapon. Now he unleashed it. It was the V-1 bomb, a basic, unmanned cruise missile. Its name revealed its true purpose, Vergeltungswaffe, the vengeance weapon. This was not a strategic tool designed to win the war. It was an engine of pure terror, aimed over the channel at the civilian heart of Great Britain. The British soon gave it nicknames, the buzz bomb or the doodlebug, after the loud pulsing hum of its thruster. That sound became a unique psychological horror. But as terrifying as the noise was, the silence was worse. When the buzzing suddenly stopped, everyone on the ground knew that the bomb was in its final dive. 15 seconds later, a huge explosion would rip the air. This was the desperate, spiteful act of a regime that, having failed to conquer, would now settle for simply inflicting pain.
And half a world away, the Axis alliance was crumbling from the other direction.
While the Wehrmacht reeled from Bagration, the Americans were scoring decisive points in the Pacific. Their target was the Mariana Islands, with the first objective being the fortress of Saipan. The battle was a catastrophe for Japan. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft were slaughtered, and on July 9, 1944, Saipan fell. The political shockwave in Tokyo was immediate. Prime Minister Tojo, who had tried to conceal the disaster, was forced to resign 9 days later. When the truth came out, he lost all credibility. This wasn't just a German crisis, it was a global Axis collapse. The Americans had secured their path to the Japanese home islands, proving that on every front, the tide had irrevocably turned. But the most potent threat to Adolf Hitler in July 1944 wasn't from an Allied army, it was from his own inner circle. We pivot now from the War of Grand Armies to the story of one man, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. He was not a natural-born conspirator. A charismatic aristocrat from a high-ranking Catholic family, Stauffenberg was a loyal soldier who had at first been aligned with Hitler's rise to power. But his conscience turned. He was horrified by the regime's inhumanity, especially the state-sponsored terror of Kristallnacht and the atrocities against the Jewish population. He came to believe Hitler was a madman who was driving Germany to total ruin. Then, in 1943, his vehicle was bombarded during the Tunisian campaign. His wounds were horrific. He survived but lost his left eye, his right hand, and most of the fingers on his left.
This maimed officer, now an active member of the German resistance, was paradoxically the perfect assassin. He was a confidant of Hitler who, as a war hero, could approach the Führer, and he was determined to put an end to the Nazi regime, whatever the cost. On the morning of July 20th, 1944, Stauffenberg arrived at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, armed with 2 bombs in his briefcase. The narrative of this day unfolds like a high-stakes thriller. The meeting was moved at the last minute from a concrete bunker to an above-ground wooden barracks, a change that would prove fateful. Claiming he needed to change his shirt, Stauffenberg found a room to arm the detonators using a pair of small pliers. But this was precise, delicate work. Deprived of his right hand and with only 3 fingers on his left, the task was agonizingly difficult. A guard knocked, urging him to hurry. Under immense pressure, Stauffenberg made a critical decision. He only managed to arm 1 of the 2 bombs. He entered the conference room at 12:30 p.m., placed the briefcase under the heavy oak table near Hitler, and then, mentioning an urgent phone call, excused himself from the room. But then, a moment of pure, disastrous chance. A latecomer, wanting to get closer to the table, took the seat Stauffenberg had just left. Annoyed by the briefcase at his feet, he pushed it back a few crucial centimeters, placing it on the far side of the massive, solid oak table leg. At 12:42 p.m., the bomb exploded. The room was obliterated, killing 4 men. Stauffenberg, seeing the blast from a distance, was certain no one could have survived. He bluffed his way past the checkpoints and rushed to Berlin, convinced Hitler was dead. But he was wrong. The latecomer and 3 others were dead, but Hitler himself, shielded by that heavy oak table, had survived. Once again, he had escaped death. Stauffenberg's joy and the conspiracy's hope lasted only a few hours. Around 7 p.m., that joy turned to despair as Adolf Hitler himself took to the radio. He announced to the nation that a small clique of ambitious criminals had tried to eliminate him and failed. The roundup was immediate. Before 1 a.m., Stauffenberg and his closest companions had been found and summarily shot. But for the rest, Hitler demanded a more sadistic, medieval vengeance. Over 200 other conspirators, including Stauffenberg's own brother, were dragged before a judge and sentenced to death. The sentences were horrific. Many were condemned to be hanged slowly with piano wire from butcher's hooks. This depraved revenge was then filmed, the gruesome footage shown to senior officers as a warning.
This purge didn't secure Hitler's power. It severed his last ties to reality. His paranoia now absolute, the Führer became even more paranoid and dangerous, trusting no one as his Reich crumbled. We return to France, where the German command structure, already reeling from Hitler's paranoid purge, was now facing total collapse. The stalemate in the hedgerows was about to be broken, not by inches, but by a sledgehammer. On July 25th, the Allies launched Operation Cobra. It began with a terrifying aerial bombardment, a rolling wave of thunder that pulverized the German lines, finally providing the violent answer to the Bagration. The American forces, led by General George Patton, punched through the breach and erupted into the open country of France. This was the breakthrough. The agonizing slog of July turned into a lightning advance in August. As the Americans raced south and east, and the British and Canadians pushed hard from the north, a massive pincer movement began to form. The German 7th Army, once the masters of the hedgerows, suddenly found themselves trapped. They were encircled in a shrinking area known to history as the Falaise Pocket. It was no longer a battle. It was an annihilation. Trapped by Allied ground forces and savaged from the air, the pocket became a pocket of death. The Battle of Normandy, which had begun on the beaches 2 months prior, was over. The road to Paris was now wide open.
As the Wehrmacht in northern France was being annihilated, a second hammer blow fell. On August 15, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Dragoon, the other invasion. While Overlord is remembered by all, Dragoon is often forgotten, but its impact was decisive. A massive force of 200,000 American, Free French, British, and Canadian troops landed on the coast of southern France between Toulon and Caen. They encountered surprisingly little opposition. Why? Because many Wehrmacht soldiers had been sent north to fight in Normandy. The landing was a stunning success. In less than 24 hours, Allied units had penetrated 30 kilometers inland. This created a second devastating pincer, with Allied armies now racing north from the Mediterranean and south from Normandy. All German forces in France were trapped in an inescapable strategic vice. This avalanche of victories set the stage for the emotional climax of the entire summer. For the French resistance in the capital, the news was a signal. On August 19th, the uprising of Paris began. By August 20th, the city was in total revolt, with barricades and trenches springing up in the streets.
Allied command, namely General Eisenhower, felt it was too early to move on the capital. But Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French, would not see a repeat of Warsaw. He issued an ultimatum threatening to send his 2nd Armored Division into Paris alone if necessary. Eisenhower gave his green light. As the Free French fought gloriously toward the city center, an enraged Hitler gave a final, terrible order. Paris should not fall into enemy hands, otherwise totally in ruins. The German commander, Dietrich von Koltitz, was ordered to inflict maximum damage, but in a moment of historic consequence, he took the brave decision to disobey his Führer's unworthy orders. He surrendered the city intact. To the ecstatic cheers of a liberated people, Charles de Gaulle made his triumphant speech, "We have lived the most great moments in our history. Long live France." But even as Paris celebrated a horrific tragedy, one of the war's most cynical betrayals was unfolding 800 miles to the east. We cross-cut from the joy of liberation to the agony of Warsaw. On August 1, 1944, with the unstoppable Red Army approaching the city, the Polish Home Army triggered a general uprising, bravely confronting the German troops. They were eager to triumph over their oppressors and liberate their own capital, just as the Parisians had. But then the unthinkable happened. The Red Army, after its lightning advance, stopped. They remained stationed just a few kilometers from the city, and for 63 days they did not intervene.
Historians still debate this sudden halt. Was the Red Army truly exhausted and out of fuel after Operation Bagration, as the Soviets claimed? Or was it a cold, deliberate political move by Stalin, a decision to let the Nazis annihilate the independent Polish resistance, ensuring Poland could not oppose a Soviet regime after the war? The result was a slaughter. The Germans countered the uprising with brutal force. After 63 days, the Poles were forced to surrender. 18,000 insurgents were dead, and between 120,000 and 200,000 Polish civilians had been killed, many murdered by German troops. After the surrender, the Nazis systematically burned the old town, leaving only ruins for the Red Army to finally capture. The months of July, August, and September 1944 were crucial. In just 90 days, the Third Reich had been dealt 3 fatal wounds. In the West, France was lost. The Allies had broken out of Normandy, annihilated the German Seventh Army, and liberated Paris. In the East, Operation Bagration had shattered the Wehrmacht, leaving an unstoppable Red Army rushing from the borders of Poland.
And from within, the failed July 20th plot had left Hitler paranoid and his command structure in tatters. By the end of the summer, the Second World War was not yet over, but it was decided. The only question left was who would get to the heart of the Reich first. The stubborn will of Adolf Hitler to fight was stronger than ever, but the end was now inevitable. The race to Berlin was now launched.